Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and it has been a time and a half, but it is time once again for another Shelf of Many Things, where I review independent and small press tabletop role-playing games and RPG accessories. This time I'm taking a look at Low Fantasy Gaming Deluxe Edition from Pickpocket Press. It is an expanded and fleshed out version of Low Fantasy Gaming, which I reviewed some considerable amount of time ago. While the basic edition is freely available, the deluxe edition is a paid option available as a PDF or in a number of print-on-demand formats. Low Fantasy Gaming Deluxe Edition offers all of the information in the basic book, plus another 100 pages or so of content, new color art, additional classes, a number of extra rules, and slightly revised content organization. The fundamental rule system remains the same, so whether or not Low Fantasy Gaming Deluxe Edition is worth the purchase price depends on how much you enjoy the new content versus the old stuff, and how much you want to support the developer, or how much you want a print version if you take that option. This review, however, will be based on the PDF version, so do keep that in mind. We will start with the overall layout. Low Fantasy Gaming Deluxe Edition has a bit over 280 pages, clocking in at around 100 more than the free version. Pages are full color, although there is a print-friendly version available, and most of the color really matters on section headings and images, rather than just in general on the background. Generally speaking, layout is in two-column with inline images, with the occasional full-page or full-width image with text clearly formatted for ease of reference. Moving on, the contents themselves are divided into 27 main sections and 4 appendices, some with several subsections. To quickly summarize, it starts with a description of the gaming system, followed by character creation rules. A discussion of the attributes follow, and then the included races and classes. Unique features that can be added to characters follow that, then there's the skill system, and then bonds that you can use to tie the party together. Equipment is then described, followed by general resolution rules, combat rules, their recovery and healing rules. A section on the magic system includes the spell list, and then there's a section on character advancement. General GM tools and rules for exploration in various environments follow. It continues with some information on hirelings, then goes on to the madness rules and mass combat rules. The monster section follows, along with rules for morale and NPC reactions. There's some general information on rival adventuring parties and tavern brawl rules, then major sections on traps and treasure. The final major section talks about the Midlands low fantasy setting available separately, as well as other suitable settings. And even though I usually go into depth on these, don't expect too much more information on some of these chapters, because what I've just summarized is exactly what's on the tin on some of them. However, let's take a look at the system itself. Low Fantasy Gaming Deluxe Edition, like the core game, is a D20-derived system that seeks to present a way of doing things reminiscent of the old-school systems, but with modern amenities. Further, it does not seek to be a retro clone, but rather to present a gaming system suited to mimic the sort of low fantasy settings that you would see in fiction, where magic is scarce and dangerous, instantaneous magical healing is not available, combats can be dangerous and gritty, and then there's a focus on realistic, or at least semi-realistic solutions that involve planning and martial exploits over fantastic magical workarounds. As such, it has a number of drastic changes from what you would expect of similarly derived system. All of this and more is detailed in the introductory section, which also includes an example of play in text form. Character creation rules follow the introduction, and Low Fantasy Gaming in all of its formats uses a variation on the classic 6 stats, except that they've been changed and expanded to 8. There's strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, and charisma remaining from leftover systems, but wisdom has been split out into perception and willpower, and an additional derived luck score has been added. Luck influences not only a number of general passive styles of saves, but may also be used as an expendable resource that is slowly regained over time. Use of luck is not automatic in all instances, and using it does reduce the effectiveness of luck checks and saves, so using it for an immediate gain may put a character at risk longer term. A mention of zero-level ordeals is made in this section, but the concept is left to a separate free PDF to flesh out, and is basically the idea of taking a zero-level character and then going through an adventure so that they actually earn their right to be an adventurer. As far as character creation goes, it uses a modified 4d6 drop the lowest system as its default system, except that each character is actually guaranteed at least one moderately high stat, not the most, but moderately high. There's an alternative array method listed as well. Stat bonuses are similar to 3rd edition, except that the average range in the middle, like the median range, has been expanded 1 point to either side, pushing the bonuses further up or down the point scale a bit and resulting in somewhat more slightly familiar overall curve to old school style games, at least within the 3 to 18 range, which is where most of your things are going to be. Next up is the races, and that's a section that's been moved up from where it appeared in the basic rule set, with a couple of new races added. Whereas basic low fantasy gaming had humans, elves, and dwarves, the deluxe edition adds halflings and half-scorn are something akin to half-orcs in the LFG world. Each race has a description, as well as some potential modifiers and abilities, although aside from halflings, these don't take the form of just flat-out ability score bonuses. Rather, they are notations on what senses the creature has. Some of them have special senses, whether they may gain advantage in certain types of rolls, and some of them just have additional abilities that are hard to define. Humans even get a small write-up with an optional ability to spice up choosing humans when other races are in play so that they don't just lose out. After the races, classes are detailed, with each class having a brief description, a table which lists their key attribute, hit points per level, allowed armor and weapons, skills, a chart of the class's attack bonus per level, then a list of individual abilities that they gain at certain levels with descriptions therein. While many class concepts will be familiar to veterans of D20 style systems, low fantasy gaming has a number of key differences in how classes are handled. Classes are limited to level 12 overall to prevent power creep and epic kind of things. Hit dice are about half of what you'd expect of an equivalent class in D20 derived system, but augmented by a flat bonus of half the die. For instance, if a class would normally have 6 hit dice in a D20 system, now low fantasy gaming gives it a D3 for hit dice, but then adds a 3, so it's D3 plus 3 for each level. This overall leaves the characters a little bit tougher. This is necessary because of the lack of instant healing classes, as low fantasy gaming does avoid that. A variety of class-specific abilities are sprinkled throughout the levels of each class, but each class also gets another choice of another ability at certain levels, custom designed for that particular character, not the class. These essentially serve the purpose of feats in other D20 systems, but may be completely customized and made up by the player and the GM to suit the story and the campaign. There are a number of examples, unique features included later in the book, and we'll talk about that when we get to that section. In terms of classes, the deluxe version includes the 5 basic classes in the original LFG: the Barbarian, who is a high-damage raging warrior; the Bard, a diplomat and support class; the Fighter, your basic warrior class; the Magic User, your basic caster class and the only caster class; and finally, the Rogue, a stealthy trickster. However, it also includes 4 completely new classes, some of which may not fit in every campaign. There's the Artificer, who is an inventor that uses machines and alchemy; the Cultist, who is a priest of some otherworldly entity who uses supernatural blessings; the Monk, a fighting ascetic; and the Ranger, who is a wilderness warrior who gains a beastly companion. As you can see, a few of these may not be appropriate for every low fantasy world, like the Monk and the Artificer. After the class list are the aforementioned unique features that can be selected on those levels that give a choice of unique feature. There are simple examples here which can be used to base others off of, but there's enough of them to really count as their own system and cover pretty much all the bases you'd want, and you can always derive from them to make your own on your particular game. Skills come next, and while their descriptions are very brief, a discussion of the reroll pool is the most important part of this section and actually goes beyond skills. While being proficient in a skill does grant a minor bonus in low fantasy gaming, instead of having a broadly scaling bonus like other D20 systems, having a skill instead also grants access to a reroll pool, which allows players to reroll a skill check a limited number of times. They are also used for luck rolls and rolls regarding recovery and death, so they all come out of the same pool. Party bonds follow and are basically an easy way to give the party members a reason to adventure together by giving them some background event that bound them. This again is just a list of examples and can be expanded on. I do find it a useful concept to borrow for other systems though, since I'm not exactly one to chase down every single member of a party and make sure they all have a reason to adventure. In fact, in some cases, I've just said, hey, if you don't have a reason for your character to adventure, I'm not going to twist your arm. They just don't go. This kind of avoids that by giving something to tie the group together. The equipment section is similar to how it's handled in the original Low Fantasy Gaming set, dividing equipment into tiers by rarity. Each rarity costs a different amount of gold, and random rather than on a per-item basis. You get to roll how much each value is on that item. But availability rules have also been added, which may make rarer equipment take more time to acquire and be available only in limited quantities, besides just the cost. Deluxe Edition also offers gear packs suitable for individual classes, basically your standard adventuring gear pack for easy character creation. Like the basic rules, the equipment section includes cost for vehicles, animals, and buildings, then a description of a selection of weapons. Now, some weapons may have special properties. In fact, most weapons have special properties listed in their description, and there's enough variation in those special properties that there is actually reason to use a variety of weapons rather than just picking the best one for damage. Armor, by contrast, is handled in groups, so that instead of going out and making all armor useful, it kind of just makes the individual groups useful. All armors of a certain class, light, medium, or heavy, cost the same amount and are basically as effective as every other armor type in that class, barring additional qualities due to special materials. The bonuses for each class of armor are actually pretty minor overall, they scale up, but they don't scale up that much, which can shift the focus of combat a bit, specifically by lowering your overall AC and therefore making more hits land when you actually get to combat. After all of this, the actual rules for doing things follow, which goes into the various sorts of checks that you can find within the game. These boil down to attribute checks, which use the old school style of trying to roll under an attribute, attack rolls that function like most modern D20 systems, luck checks that decrease luck as they happen, a party challenge system, which is similar to the skill challenges of 4th edition era, except I think they're actually handled better in lower fantasy gaming, and then simple percentile checks, which are basically if you got a certain percent chance of something happening. There are various rules for modifiers and such, but nothing a veteran of role-playing systems hasn't seen in the past. The combat rules follow, and it's about what one would expect if familiar with D20 systems. Initiative functions off of a dexterity check. Instead of ordering the party, it just determines whether people that succeed go before the opponents or not. You never actually have to roll initiative for the monsters. And within a group of player characters, those player characters kind of sort out amongst each other when they want to go. This does somewhat vary from the original LFG system, which is offered as one of the few different optional systems that are listed. Other than that, combat pretty much proceeds similar to a D20 system, offering each character a move and an action, which may include attacks. There are rules for pursuit baked into the combat rules to break up the monotony of movement rate-based chases, where all the characters have similar movement rates. And there is the opportunity for martial exploits, which are basically open-ended anything besides basic attack that you may want a character to do with the enemy. This can include some pretty minor effects as well as major effects if things line up right. And like much of low fantasy gaming, you kind of have to work it out with the GM involved on the spot according to the situation, and then they'll decide what kind of exploit it is. There are also minor rules for various fighting styles and other combat situations that may pop up in this section. The rules on injury and healing are a little bit more complex and yet a little bit more forgiving than most D20 systems, largely because of the non-reliance on magical healing. Rather than a series of saves or tracking negative hit points, when a character goes down at the end of combat, you roll to see whether the character is dead or mostly dead, and then if they recover, there is a injury and setback table that can grant some sort of temporary or permanent injury, depending on how lucky you are, from such a state. Recovery takes place during short and long rests, similar to 5th edition, except that long rests require much, much more time and are undertaken in a town or other safe place rather than on the road. Short rest benefits require will checks to actually gain, benefit from, and lose effectiveness if you take multiple short rests. Basically, you're limited to 3 short rests, and you can actually determine which order you take them in, because each short rest gets a set number of opportunities to benefit from it, to recover abilities, things like that. So you can decide whether you want to use one that gives you lots of benefits right up front, or if you're not that wounded, then one of the smaller ones and use the heavier short rest later on. The magic system is where the Deluxe Edition and the low fantasy gaming in general sets itself apart from D20 systems. There is a possibility for spell interruption. Basically, if the character takes damage before their turn, then they just can't cast a spell. But there is also something called dark and dangerous magic that makes it increasingly harder to cast spells without complications the more you cast in a particular session. A roll of increasing difficulty is triggered at each spell casting, with failure resulting in a roll on a random table of potential side effects, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them completely insane. This was all present in the basic rules, but Deluxe Edition also adds divine blessings and rebukes for the cultists. Instead of proper spells, cultists expend favor to implement magical effects called blessings, or they may try to, trigger one of those blessings without expending favor, but at that they risk drawing the ire of their patron. The spells themselves have been mostly renamed in Deluxe Edition, and some of their effects have been altered, making for a spell list that is similar to basic D20 games, but with more subtle effects in many instances, or effects that have some sort of dark and unpleasant tinge to them, although they are mechanically almost identical, with names that evoke a certain dark theme, things like Gaze of Beguilement instead of Charm Person, for instance. There are only 6 spell levels to match the reduced level cap in low fantasy gaming. The section on advancement explains the 2 leveling options available in LFG. You don't track experience, but rather you have downtime leveling that just lets the character level up when you have downtime between adventures, and then the session advance, which has each individual gaming session allowing for a partial level up on a chart for anyone who participated, and this level up might be random. Effectively, this spreads out the benefits of a level up over time so that characters don't just suddenly shoot up in capability, and it can vary a group's experience and or leveling up overall, both due to the random nature and due to the fact that if somebody doesn't attend a session, they don't get the session level up. It is a nice option to have. This section also covers things that characters can do in their downtime, although most options are left as very loose guidelines. A miscellany of GM tools follows, with rules for black powder weapons thanks to the Alchemist and Naval Combat. The Naval Combat section is actually pretty extensive and is broken into phases using a sort of random event-based system to break up the narrative, which is followed up in theme by the mass battle system, which I'll talk about later on. Before that, though, there's examples of various ship stats, as well as ways you can advance your crew when they're surviving a battle. Rules for disease follow, including a number of pretty interesting examples. This is followed by a number of parasites that characters may pick up, which is an interesting touch. A dungeon room generator is offered, and it's not for mapping, like it doesn't tell you the dimensions of the rooms, but rather has a list of randomized room descriptions that can be adjusted according to your needs for quick dungeon generation. Overland exploration rules are discussed and are set up with an event system that can offer various random occurrences beyond the usual random encounters. You can have things that aren't combat or aren't encounters but are still notable. Similar random events are offered for underground and voyage travels. Random encounter rules are given next, including rules for finding the distance during a random encounter, along with example tables for many different terrains. The tables are a bit different from what I'm personally used to seeing with other D20 settings, although they are interesting as examples of what can be done in the system and are extensive enough to use as a basic resource even without adding to them. Rules for hirelings follow, although again it's mostly just guidelines. This is accompanied by tables of various characteristics such as names, quirks, backgrounds, etc. for quick generation. There are some rules for advancing hirelings, much like crew members in Naval Combat, allowing them to get a little bit tougher without becoming full-fledged PCs. There's decent rules for madness, which take the form of exacerbating traits, since the idea of madness inflicted by supernatural forces kind of permeates the genre in terms of the fiction of the sword and sorcery fiction and things like that you usually find in low fantasy settings. Rules for mass battle follow, and there are 2 sets of rules for it. The first functions on a similar event-based cycle as the prior Naval Combat, with a focus on the party being faced by several individual events over the course of a battle that they can overcome, with consequences for failure and success that have impact on the unit-based combat. The unit-based combat that follows is a more traditional system dealing with groups of units of dozens or hundreds strong, and a combat system that uses event tables to resolve the combat rather than 2-hit rolls. The monster list follows and is a pretty standard kind of monster list for these sorts of RPGs, with monster stats given along with basic descriptions of the monsters. There are a couple things to watch out for, though. Most monsters have a special effect that occurs on a natural 19 attack roll, 19 because 20s are just critical hits. There is also the idea of a boss monster, which is basically just a template. You can go ahead and apply it to pretty much any number of monsters, adding various abilities and attacks at the GM's options. There's guidelines for making your own monsters tool with a list of the sorts of AC, luck, and damage that you should expect according to the monster's certain hit dice range, although of course you can vary that as it's all just guidelines. Simple discussions of morale follows, as well as NPC reactions for when the GM just is not certain how an NPC is going to react to a certain approach. Tables for quickly putting together rival adventurers follow, which is a more useful tool than I'd honestly like to see in a lot more RPGs. Continuing with the miscellaneous nature of this section, randomized tavern brawl events are given for when the characters get into a fight. Then example traps, both simple and complex, are given, and there are quite a few of these. They are pretty well fleshed out and can be used as inspiration for more. Finally, the treasure rules are given. There's carry loot, which is a random table of what you might find in a particular monster or person's pockets, and all follow the same table instead of having different categories. While lair treasures are something you might expect of older D20-based games, where each hit dice of origin creature gives a chance at a magic item, a random amount of gold, and then a chance at a number of valuables. There's also trinkets and curios tables in there for random items of interest that you might find just about anywhere. This is followed by some tables detailing valuables, jewelry, and other items of monetary value that you might find in a treasure. Then there are the various magic items. Magic items in low fantasy gaming are meant to be rare and to come on the idea of potions and scrolls, which are temporary items and are actually, properly described in the book, and then other useful permanent items. The more general permanent items, they have to be attuned, similar to the 5th edition thing, and may have obvious properties that come up during attunement, as well as discrete properties that are not immediately obvious, of course. Using a magic item's power is subject to the dark and dangerous magic rules, so even a warrior who picks up like a shield that can do a special, magical effect, they're subject to those dark and dangerous magic rules, just the same as everybody else. Although they don't necessarily follow the same formulaic, item descriptions that you might see in a lot of other games. Rather, any kind of effect can be on pretty much any kind of item. After the treasure section, the book wraps up with a brief discussion on the Midlands low magic sandbox setting, which is available separately, as well as a list of other potential settings which one may use in the low fantasy gaming system, whether from gaming systems or fiction in general. There are 4 appendices thereafter, one that shows the spell names as they appeared in Classic and how they've been renamed in Deluxe, which is very useful to look stuff up. There's an NPC generator, a quick cheat sheet for unit combat when you're doing the mass combat rules, and then a sample character sheet. So, before I get into the system, I'll go right out and say that it's technically very well written. I didn't see much of anything in the way of editing errors or things like that I see in so many other indie products. It's very clear to read and well organized, better organized than the original rules, and I rather enjoyed those. So they started good and then they went better. Prime job all in all in that regard. I love the new art. It's really expressive and it makes it feel like a very, very solid system. In terms of the system itself, it's just more of the same of the original. It's got a lot. It's got more examples of classes and it's just more fleshed out. This is not a bad thing. I really enjoyed the original system, and if you enjoyed that, then you're probably going to enjoy this. It does require a bit more time investment in terms of a GM than some other systems in terms of the low fantasy gaming system altogether, although LFG Deluxe Edition does help a little bit with that by providing way more examples of things that you can quickly look up and plug in, which can take a little bit of that burden off. In terms of balancing out abilities, coming up with your own stuff, educating combat actions, that's still things that you're going to have to work on as a GM. So there's still some work there to be done. It does make those unique aspects a part of the core rules itself in terms of GMing, the GM deciding on something while still providing a robust system without those additions. So that's good. Basically what you might call homebrew in another system is not homebrew, even though you're homebrewing. It's just part and parcel of how LFG works. As for what is there besides that, I think that it implements a very good balance between an old school feel and a modern 5th edition style of D20 mechanics. It walks that line pretty well. I haven't played the original system nearly as often as I would like, and this just builds on that, so I actually really want to run this system, and chances are I'm probably not going to be able to run it. I'll be able to run it a couple of games, so I may not be able to run it as much as I really like. If you like the original system, as I said, you're going to like this one. So this brings me around to the changes and additions beyond what was in the original system. The renaming of spells was an interesting touch. I know it's going to make things a little bit harder to look up, but at the same time, your people may not immediately recognize a spell merely by the name, which is a good thing. It will take, some getting used to, though. The additional classes are not going to mesh well with every game, and I can see why they weren't in the basic rules. The Artificer class is only going to work with low fantasy from a little bit more technically developed setting. The Cultist does a solid job of capturing a sort of religious fanatic feel without being just another generic cleric ripoff. The martial artist monk is pretty bog standard as your generic martial artist monk and may not be appropriate for a more purely Western-based setting, but, we've had that problem with, basic D&D and stuff like that. The Ranger is about the only new class that I could have seen warranted as a basic class put in the original version, because it is pretty wide-ranging in what it can, in what it can be accepted in. All of the new classes are very decent and well-balanced, so that's really not an issue. There's none of these are going to be really overpowering. Even the Artificer that adds all sorts of gadgets and, the ability to use firearms in some instances is not really going to not really going to overpower any of the other classes. As for new races, they are pretty basic. There's just 2 of them, but there are 2 that are popular in many settings, so they are well worth the include. There are a couple of new monsters, but not that many. I think I saw maybe 1 or 2. The real meat of the additions comes in the form of the expanded rules and the expanded tables of examples. In terms of entirely new rules, you got mass combat, naval combat, and so forth, and those are very, very good additions. What I found interesting about these systems is the use of critical events to effectively break what might devolve into a slog or an exercise in number crunching in other systems. I like how they're different enough from each other to focus on their particular given aspect of the game, but consistent enough to genuinely feel like they're part of the same overall system, which is sadly not something as a guarantee when dealing with role-playing games, even major ones. So considering the original version was and is still free, is the extra material and presentation of Deluxe Edition worthwhile? Honestly, the presentation is similar, although the new art, as I said, is wonderful and makes it feel like a top-tier product, so you're not going to feel like you just paid a fair amount of sum for just a churned over PDF. I think the new material really only merits it, though, if this is going to be your main system for a long, drawn-out campaign for quite some time. If you're only intending to run low fantasy gaming as the main system for, a one-shot or just a couple adventures, then you're probably going to go ahead and pick up the original rules, which are free, rather than this one. If you do intend to make low combat gaming the main system you're going to run a full campaign with, though, the deluxe version is definitely the way to go, especially since a fair amount of the newer material is suited for more experienced adventurers who are getting into running their own war bands and going to travel, to distant places. I personally have a hard time getting my groups to deviate too much from the big systems. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again, but if you can, and I know a lot of the people that watch me can because they've got a more acceptable group of local people that can go ahead and they're working on trying out new systems. If you've got a group that's like that, then this is definitely one of those systems that will reward you. It has a different feel, just enough of a different feel from other D20 systems to not even remotely seem to be just another generic clone, especially if run correctly, and it benefits from a fair amount of support in the form of the Midland setting and numerous adventure frameworks that are available. Basically, mini adventures that can be used for any medieval fantasy system and plugged into any campaign, but are statted out right out of the gate for low fantasy gaming, so you can just plug them in and play. Anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I've rambled on enough about this one. I'm going to put links where you can pick up both the original and deluxe versions in the description below. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer, and it feels so good to be doing more reviews again. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.